let me introduce dear guest, Professor Eleonore Kofman. Professor Kofman is a leading international scholar on gender and migration, and in particular on theoretical and policy aspects of family-related and skilled labor migration. She is working at Middlesex University London, but also is a visiting professor at the Institute of Global Affairs and the London School of Economics. She is also, of course, extensively publishing. I'm not going through the long list of your publications, but perhaps I will just mention your new co-authored book, Gender Migration and Global Social Reproduction. Perhaps it's going to be kind of related to your talk today. And she also published articles on the dynamics of care on South-South migration. Eleonore is a member of Executive Board of IMISCO, International Migration, Integration and Social Cohesion in Europe. And also she is working currently with UN Women on their 2018 flagship report, Progress of the World's Women, Families in the Changing World, and has conducted research on the impact of policies in this field for the European Women's Lobby and the Office of the Children's Commissioner UK and other NGOs. So she is deeply also involved in applied activities, and we heard that it's our role today not just to publish academic articles, but also to speak to stakeholders and to policymakers and so on. So I'm really glad you came, especially because I'm deeply inspired myself by your work. Please take your floor.
Okay, so I don't know whether to... the computer is down here, but I speak quite loudly. I don't know if there's...
Do you want to stand or do you want to sit?
Sorry?
This is just a light.
Oh, it's just a light. So the mic's here. Okay, that's
But you
fine.
don't need the mic if you don't...
No, if you want... I mean, it depends, because if I'm sitting, then you may not hear me. So do you want me to put the mic on?
Are you okay with it, or...?
Well, they actually said that for the recording, it's better without the mic, so...
Oh, it's okay. Look, it's up to you. If you tell me if you want me to... change. Okay. So first of all, many thanks both to Petra and to Susanna, because we've known each other for some time through various conferences, often around issues of care, and I'm so pleased to be here. This is not my first time in Prague, so this is the reason I'm not staying the weekend, because I have been several times before. So, but I thank you very much for inviting me, and I think we're going to have some very stimulating conversations. So what I've tried to do here in the presentation is to bring together two bodies of literature, I think, that should be talking to each other much more, because as you'll see, through the concept of transnational families, they actually come together. So the first is the whole issue around family migrations, which basically are in the European context, not in other countries beyond that, but in the European context and in so-called settler societies, is actually the largest form of migration, yet we don't give to it adequate attention. And the other is the concept of social reproduction, and I think that's going to tie up with Monica's talk at the end, because obviously care is a large part of social reproduction, but my argument is it's not the only part. It doesn't take over the whole of social reproduction. So I'm going to try to bring these together. Do you think I'm sure? Yep. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is to look at policies towards migration of family members. And I'm talking, you'll see why I use the term family members rather than family migration, which is simply a type of migration. Because that links to this issue of the fact that in the, you could say, the global political economy, what we find is that the rights to live together in the way that one would wish to is very severely circumscribed by immigration regulations, both of states and of regional authorities like the European Union. So what I will be arguing is that what that has produced is a hierarchy of stratified rights, producing, as Susanna said, exclusion and inclusion and differentiated inequalities. And thirdly, what I want to have a look is how the impact of these conditions of family life, you could say, impacts on what we could call transnational social reproduction, both in countries of origin, which is where what work has been done more on reproduction has been usually concentrated on countries of origin, but I want to argue that the conditions of social reproduction in countries of destination have also been severely undermined and severely restricted by contemporary migration regulations. And that also to some extent ties up with Stefan's talk about what can the global compacts do. I'm not going to talk about that, but I do want to say that in the global compacts, attention is largely focused on labour migration if we look at the migration compact, and there is very, very little work on the rights that families may have to live together. So again, we'll see they're secondary. So what we can start off is that in the past, and certainly probably until the early years of this decade, theoretically, politically, and in policy terms, family migrations and the right of family members to live together received really very little attention, but this has been growing for good and for bad reasons in the last 15 to 20 years. Now, in part, I would say this greater attention in the academic literature comes out of greater focus on the social dimensions of migration and sociocultural dimensions in particular. So it's coming out of anthropology largely and sociology. And in particular, if you go back into the migration literature from the 1990s, we have the emergence of the whole discussion on transnationalism, methodological nationalism, and out of that comes another body of work, which I'll talk a bit more about in a few minutes, is transnational families. So that's where this body of work is coming, because the literature on transnationalism basically was an attempt not just to argue against methodological nationalism, but also to argue that social networks and the social dimension of migration was to be given credence and attention as much as economic factors. Okay, so what then that gave rise to was the notion of transnational families, which can be defined as families that live some or most of the time separated from each other, yet hold together and create something that can be seen as a feeling of collective welfare and unity, namely familyhood, even across national borders. And there was the book by Bryson and Deborah Bryson and Ulla Vorella, which brought together largely, it was studies of African families in Europe. And again, this is an area that there's been quite a lot of work. But the point about that here is that if we're going to be looking at transnational migrations, one of the important facets of transnational migrations is the fact that families are living transnationally. It's not just that there's labour migration, it's the families are in fact living transnationally. Now, we can also argue that if we look at family members, we're not just talking about family migrations, because one of the important elements of the UN Women's Report called Progress of the World's Women, and in the chapter on families on the move, was that they were very much concerned to show that any form of migration leads to changes in family configurations, in family arrangements, in how one lives transnationally. We only need to think that it doesn't just apply to labour migrants, but it also applies to refugees, and very much so today, because many refugees who manage to escape cannot bring their family members with them, and they may well live for decades estranged from family members. So the question of the reconfiguration of family life as a result of migration applies whether it's labour migration, refugees, students, the retired, etc. So it applies across the board. Now, some in the process of migration do actually manage to move with their whole family. It's much more likely to be skilled migrants or those earning a high income. But for very large numbers, migration generates separated and transnational families. And I've given an example already of refugees in particular, who are often very hard hit because they leave family members behind, and then the regulations prevent them from reuniting subsequently. Or, as we were talking with Monica over breakfast, is that you have refugees dotted from the same family, dotted throughout Europe. So you might have somebody coming one person coming to the Czech Republic, somebody is left in Austria, someone else might be in Germany, Sweden, etc. So this is also an issue that I think is going to become much more significant when we go beyond thinking about just the individual refugee coming in and settling. Okay, so to follow on with this, as I've said already, the issue of families and transnational families was previously absent in theoretical discussions because the family was treated as a secondary consideration. It wasn't seen as a primary driver. In part, I would argue this was because we're still in the situation that probably 60+% of family migrants themselves consist of women, and as we know, women until more recently were less important in not just in terms of policy, but certainly theoretically and in policy terms were less important. But we also at the same time continue, I would argue, to underestimate how familial you could say, and intimate reasons actually propel migration. In the European Union, family reasons, both for men and for women, are actually more important than labour. But we never highlight that. We always highlight the labour aspect. And in fact, familial and intimate reasons may propel migration, especially for women who may be leaving failing marriages, they may be trying to get away from domestic violence, but they're also more likely to move for reasons of marriage and cohabitation, because, of course, cohabitation these days is much more acceptable, but also it is actually recognized in many countries' migration legislation. So here are just two references to some of the works which have looked at what they call now not just family, but intimate relationships, because intimate means that we can take all kinds of other kinship relationships also into account. And of course, the other thing is that what's happened also, but I'm not going to have the time to go into it, another aspect of family is, of course, that we can take LGBTQ relationships into account when we're looking at family movements. And I think here we should. So the nature of the family also, and we need to bear that in mind, has in fact broadened. Less so in immigration legislation, but in Europe it's increasingly also coming back to European Council or the Court of Justice deliberations. But nevertheless, there's a broader view of what family is. But for migration purposes, the view of the family is often still very backward, deliberately slow, of course, very traditional. So for migration purposes, the family is still often constituted of a narrow form of the nuclear family, rather than grandparents even or extended kin. So that's going to be important when we look at legislation. So what we have is, following on from the academic studies, is there's been, in the last 20 years, I would say, a very negative discourse on the burden of family migrants. Why? Because, again, remember, the majority doesn't mean all, but let's say between 50-60% in most countries will be women of family migrants. They're seen as being often not wanting to work without much evidence. That's usually the case. There seem to be a drain on welfare expenditure, and I want to come back to this whole issue of welfare expenditure and the intervention of states. They seem to be problematic subjects of integration, and again, this is often linked with the fact that supposedly women do not want to participate in the labour market. And of course, this is targeted often towards Muslim women, because a lot of the studies you see on problematic integration is actually problematic integration of Muslim women. And then another body of negative discourse problematizes the reproduction of future citizens, that we have inadequate mothers. It's usually argued we're going to have inadequate future citizens. So these are some of the negative discourses that have been very prevalent in the last 20 years. But the importance of these negative discourses is that their arguments are used to restrict the ability of families to reunite for all kinds of reasons. So the policy making actually follows on from these arguments, and it reflects the above arguments in countries with family migration regimes. I mean, a full-scale regulation of the different members of the family that may or may not enter. And this, what I would call a family migration regime, is largely limited to OECD countries. And what has developed again in the last 20 years is greater restrictions on family members, on entry, residence, and access to welfare and citizenship. And I will make the point as we go through this, obviously this has an impact on the right to live together and on the prevalence of transnational families. This is the connections that I'm making. So if we start off in settler societies, in the 1990s already, there was a targeted reduction of family migrants. So there was a shift, usually through quotas at that time, to shift the quotas away from family migrants, which were usually the majority, to labour migrants, and particularly skilled labour migrants. So it had the mantra, although they didn't use the discourse yet, but there was the mantra of the brightest and the best, meaning the most educated and the most skilled. So that's who they wanted. And so migration legislation in those countries shifted. Australia, it's literally went from 2/3 to 1/3 of family. Canada, it's even more. It's gone down to 20%. And this is very important for my argument about social reproduction, as we'll see, is that it particularly targeted parents and grandparents on the grounds that they were irrelevant to the economy. So what we're doing there is saying, okay, your contribution to social reproduction is irrelevant. What we're interested in is your direct contribution to production, i.e. being members of the labour force. So what, again, and I haven't the time to go into, but the whole point is that it's cutting off the relationship of social reproduction and production, basically, of showing how the two are closely connected. So as a result of that, many parents can only come in on a temporary basis with no right to work and no right to welfare. Now we can go on to the next chapter of this in settler societies. Donald Trump has been very active in the area of family migration. And now he didn't start off the debate. It's been going for some time in the US because the US, in its migration system, still doesn't have a coherent labour migration policy, and its family migration proportion is the highest of any of the OECD countries. So this debate has been going on for a long time. But of course, what Trump has tried to do is to bypass Congress. So basically, he's ensured that they don't have any scrutiny for what's happening. And he's brought in two regulations which are being contested by the courts. But nevertheless, what he's trying to do effectively is to reduce, through other means, the number of family migrants coming into the country. So he's doing it by saying, if you've ever called upon what's called public charges or welfare of any kind, you are undermining your chances of either entering or getting a green card. And the second piece is that he wants to force migrants to obtain an eligible health insurance within 30 days. And in the US, that's extremely difficult. So what he's trying to do by both of these two measures is to reduce the family migration component. So again, he will contribute to the enlargement of the number of transnational families. So that's what my argument is. But again, it's the idea that family migrants don't contribute to the workforce. They do, very much so. Okay, passing to Europe, increasingly since the 1990s, and especially in past decade, we've had a whole series of restrictions being imposed on family members. So integration conditionalities, or what some have called integration at the border. In particular, minimum income. So that's particularly high in Netherlands, Norway, and the UK. And it's an area that I actually worked with an NGO, and we did a public report, and we came out with a report called Skype Families, because what we found is that the very high minimum level of income, that time 18,600 would have been about 22,000 euros per year, meant that many families were split apart, and they literally, again talking about technology, they only managed to stay together because through Skype. So that's why we called the report Skype Families, because they were forced into using technology. And this would be an example of what I would call forced transnationalism. They wanted to live together in the same country, and they were prevented. Again, it isn't just spouses and children, it's also parents, because in the UK, you virtually have to be almost on your deathbed before the government will let you in. It isn't even a question of money. It's that the conditions are so restrictive that you can't get in. So you can't be able to care for yourself, and you can't have any members of your family left in the country that you want to come from. So it's incredibly restrictive. Now, what I'm arguing here is that the two things. The restrictions actually present what Anne Staver has called an economic turn in family migration. Because family migration in the past was followed to different extent what you could see as normative principles. The idea that an individual has the right to live together in the family of their choosing. And the second aspect linked with that is the class basis. It's that I would argue it's become increasingly available to those, or to the middle classes, but even within the middle classes, to those that have economic capital. Because we did another study where we saw that young people who could have cultural capital through the degrees could not afford to reunite because they didn't have the economic capital. So it's basically very much becoming a class issue in order to have the right to bring someone in. Secondly, I would argue that the benefits for social reproduction in migration literature through care, through integration, are simply ignored or they're dismissed. So this is how I'm trying to link it up with social reproduction. Okay, so in terms of care, of course, here, families are often the major source of care and support that underpin refugee and migrant well-being. But at the same time, both of these policies are primarily designed around the implicit notions of independent adults who do not need care, i.e. your labour migrants who do not need care, or they're based on very limited notions of the family as nuclear and sufficiently able to manage their care needs. So just to give you an example, in most European countries, the only family members that can enter will be the spouse and will be children under 18 who are dependent on their parents. Other members may be let in, but it's discretionary. So you can see the narrow meaning of family, which doesn't represent at all the meaning that most people who are living with. I.e., we have the contradictory trend for most people is that their children are staying at home until 35, if not more, because of various conditions of the impossibility of, let's say, socially reproducing themselves independently. So these trends are completely contradictory. So within then the free movement areas, the third category, like EU in particular, it is much easier for a range of family members to join those already in destination countries and to circulate more freely. And again, parents and family members can join for varying periods or permanently. Now, I want to now move to the issue of formation of transnational families. Why is it an important issue? And who are some of the categories that fall under this categorization? Well, there's obviously those who do not qualify because of insufficient income or other resources. There are other people who cannot afford to have their children with them because that means they work fewer hours with children, and if public expenditure on childcare is significant, they will leave their children behind. There's those who are not permitted to have parents with them, except for short periods. There are those doing less skilled jobs, particularly in countries where accompanying families members are reserved for the skilled. And if we think outside of Europe, vast areas of Middle East, of Southeast Asia, with high percentages of temporary migrants simply are not allowed to bring in any family members. But then, of course, and then there's refugees who are experiencing longer waiting periods. And lastly, of course, there are those people who do not wish to bring their family members in for a variety of reasons. Some people don't want to bring their children in for educational purposes. They prefer the educational system of countries of origin, or for cultural reasons because they don't like Western values. So there are various reasons. So transnational families don't just arise from those who can't bring in their family members, but also those who don't wish to bring them in. Now, the prevalence of transnational families, we don't know how many there are, because most studies of transnational families have been small scale, coming out of anthropology and sociology, so it's qualitative and small is beautiful. But we don't know how it evolves. Well, we don't know a bit about how it evolves. But just to give you an idea of the scope of it, it's estimated, and that's a huge difference between 3 and 6 million, but a large number of Filipino children, for example, live in families in the Philippines where one of the or more of the parents have left for migration purposes. In 5 of 7 Latin American countries, parental absence due to migration is actually much more important than families where unions have dissolved, i.e. people have divorced or separated, so it's actually more significant. And there are also significant gender differences because amongst transnational families, women are much more likely to be single parents or working in poorly paid sectors, hence, of course, less able to qualify for family reunification and family migration regimes. So we don't know the exact prevalence, but what is happening through some of the research that is being done by Valentina Mazzucato and her team with African families in Europe is that they're trying to quantify the prevalence of transnational families and the different conditions and variables which shape their emergence or not. So there's more quantitative work. Okay, let's move on next to the second term of my talk, and that's social reproduction. Here, there's a vast literature on the International Division of Reproductive Labour, which associated with Eileen Hochschild, Rachel Parinas, and a lot of others, Helma Lutz, for example. And it's commonly used to describe migrant women's position in the global labour market, and it focuses on domestic work and care. So theoretically, you have concepts of global chains of care, which look at the transfer of both material and emotional labour from the global south to the global north. There is a large literature on that. So I'm not trying to say there is no discussion of reproduction in the gender and migration literature. What I'm saying here is that it focuses on women's work within the global economy. That's not what I'm trying to do, because what we've got relatively little discussion is of how migration actually affects social reproduction transnationally more broadly. That's a different issue. Because how I define social reproduction, which itself has gained a lot more traction in the last decade or two, and has moved on from the old very Marxist analysis to looking at social reproduction as, you could say, the production of people through various kinds of work. It could be mental work, it can be manual work, and it can be emotional. So what you're trying to look at is what is actually necessary to reproduce individuals and families now and in the future. So it will include material goods for everyday life, which this again links up with the literature on remittances quite a lot here, because that's a circulation of money, and that money is often used to buy goods, but it's also used to provide high levels of education. It also includes the socialization of children, and I think socialization, I would argue, is an element which is important, and it's missing in the care literature, because it's a different thing, and different people can be doing socialization as opposed to those who are doing care. So, for example, in some studies of Singaporean families, it's still the family that's doing the socialization. They may employ someone to do the domestic work, but the socialization of their children is still often done by family members, and I think there's differences here. So it also includes, of course, care of the infirm and the elderly, as well as the organizations within which social reproduction occurs, and that can be very different. It can be the home, it could be a residential home for elderly people, it could be community services, and it can be provided by the market, by NGOs, and by the state. So you can have what has also been called the care diamond. You can have a number of different organizations actually providing it. Now, within the literature on transnational families, and separated families in particular, much of the attention has focused on those who've been left behind, especially children, and to a lesser extent parents. And again, this focuses on countries of origin and on the problems of transnational parenting. How do you parent when you're at a distance? And there's increasing literature also on how we use technology to parent. So that's a body of literature. There's also a lot of within this targeting of mothers migrating and rather than fathers migrating. Again, mothers are always problematic. So there's a literature on what happens when mothers migrate, because what then happens is usually the reproductive tasks fall on the shoulders of other females. It may be her own mother, but it could be her sister, her aunt, etc. Or they may take on paid workers to do social reproduction. And there's much less concern with fathers, because there's the assumption, oh, well, if the father leaves, the mother simply does what she's always done, no change. That may not be the case, but that's the assumption. On the other hand, I want to argue there's been very little on countries of destination. And here I've already argued that immigration regulations actually marginalize the contribution that migrants make to social reproduction and how it actually assists economic integration. So it emphasizes the narrow concept of a migrant's contribution to economic contribution. And yet we do have studies in Canada which have shown quite clearly that extended families perform better than nuclear families, because the grandmother, in this case, is doing the childcare, for example, is socializing the children and enabling both parents to work or to improve their educational qualifications. So what we see here is that the grandparents' social reproductive roles does, in fact, contribute to production. There is that link. So again, we have evidence that families with parents have higher employment rates, especially employment rates of women. It enables educational qualifications to be obtained. Parents assist in childcare that is often expensive. And they may help with housework and family obligations, and of course help socialize children. So I think this is an important way of tying in social reproduction to the whole circuit of migration, and I would argue the relevance of taking it into account. So I think I'm on time. Yeah. Sorry.
You still have some time.
Okay. Well. Okay. So what are some concluding remarks that I want to make? In the current era, I think social reproduction has been stretched out transnationally through a circulation of material resources, obviously, that circulate within families. Because we have, obviously, remittances being circulated as a result of migration. But even when they're not, there are other kinds of resources, such as emotional resources, and support that are circulating. There is a potential, and I say potential because we don't know which direction it always goes in, but there can be changes and fundamental changes in gender and generational forms of social reproduction. Because if you think about, if we're looking at when mothers leave, what happens with social reproduction, it may still stay amongst females. And there's a big debate between Filipino researchers about when mothers leave, are the men good for nothing and they don't do anything and it's all put on other women's shoulders, or are they actually taking up some of the responsibilities? The jury is out. And the studies are very different here. But I'm just saying it's an issue that is worth us exploring. And it may also arise out of the way that you do your research, whether you do small-scale qualitative research and have hardly anyone that you're interviewing, so it's very easy to create a sample that will support your case, or I'm very much here suggesting we do mixed methods so that the quantitative can actually support the qualitative, but it does generate the fact that there have been changes as a result of transnational families, of changing forms of gender and generational forms of social reproduction. I think we also need to remember that you can be transnational at one point in your life and not in another. So I haven't talked about that, but transnational families are not something that's fixed. Their contours, their configurations change constantly over time and in space. Secondly, there's inequalities in access to reunification in relation to family members, reflecting much more restrictive immigration policies, favouring the skilled and pushing them into what we could call forced transnationalism. Now, obviously, there's different degrees of forced. There are people who may be in a position temporarily of being unable to bring their family in, and eventually they can. Another group that I haven't actually mentioned, which again, both in certain European countries, but particularly in the US, is deportation, which is leading to very large numbers of families experiencing forced transnationalism. And it doesn't come from Trump. Obama actually, during his time in the second period, in the second presidency, there was a very, very large number of deportations. And that in the States has become a very big issue because it's 90% men who are deported, leaving women and their children behind in the US. So I think that also fits into the transnational social reproduction. I would argue also that social reproduction is increasingly shouldered by migrants because in part this is linked to the attacks on the use of welfare by migrants. And that runs through so much European and US legislation now that migrants are a drain on welfare. They're using too much welfare. If you think, I don't want to mention the horrific Brexit, but it was one of the major reasons behind the vote as it was. It was the attack, and in this case it was European, originally mobile workers, but who had become migrants, i.e. the conceptualization of them was that they were migrants. And again, it was the argument was in terms of welfare often. It was less taking away our jobs and more use of welfare. So I would argue that social reproduction transnationally, social reproduction in general is increasingly shouldered by migrants, and that the attacks on welfare, which is part of the let's say the strengthening of populist sentiments against migration in many countries, is based on this issue of use of welfare. And you look at the Trump's current two policies, that's exactly what it is. And my last point here is that there's the contribution of family members is particularly neglected in their social reproduction in countries of destination. If we look at the literature, again, if we look at both the literature on social reproduction and on care, there's more on those who are left behind, but much less on what is the situation of those in countries of destination. And I'm not talking here about necessarily their contribution to the workforce, which is well studied, but it's a paper that a chapter that Poverty and Raghuram and I did, and where we had a section called Who Cares for the Carers? And when you talk about who cares for the carers, we're talking about who cares for the social reproduction of the carers in the country of destination. So I actually will argue that we really need to pay much more attention to the social reproduction of migrants, not just within transnational families, but also as workers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a rich paper, and I put some notes on it just in order to reflect, since I haven't the paper in advance. So I'm trying to put together my thoughts and my own research experiences while studying transnational mothers from Ukraine and working in the Czech Republic and studying domestic workers. So trying to put all those great ideas together, but I think you really presented us a really comprehensive way how we can think on the processes of social reproduction and mobilities and migration. So what I'm really looking for, or what I really found interesting was that, and I think it's really, you highlighted it at the beginning of your paper, that we can't look on migration just from economic perspective. We can't reduce migrants just on their economic values, but the issues of social reproduction are quite important for us, and we have to really look also. I think researchers, we are already looking on it, at least from 90s, but policymakers and stakeholders, they have to look on migrants from a more complex way of social life. Migrants, they have their social life. What you, and just in the terms of the Czech Republic, perhaps some of you in the audience can think that it's not the issue here, transnational families, but the time I've done my research, 75% of Ukrainian transnational women here working in the Czech Republic were in the situation of transnational mothers. The situation is improved since the time I finished the research in 2011, and the family reunification process for mostly Ukrainian migrants is getting better. There is this kind of argument, those Slavic people, this is an argument against accepting refugees. Let's make family reunification better for Ukrainians, and not to don't accept refugees from Middle East. They have different culture and social values, as on what we already heard also. And you also mentioned the fact that when we look on transnational families, we are applying this kind of normative, sometimes even heteronormative approach on those families. We see them just as a nuclear families, and we do not speak, and we do not see them as in the forms of extended families. But for example, we had this case in the Czech Republic with accepting orphans from Syria, from the Greece. And politicians, they created the argument that they can't be orphans because they're Arab kids. And of course, they're coming from extended families. All of them, they have extended families. So on one hand, we speak about just nuclear families. On the other hand, when we want to use it as an argument, suddenly we invent the concept of extended big Arab families. Yeah, so here it comes. And what I think Monica also is researching, and she's going to present part of it, is also transnational practices for senior people left behind, because even not just major population is aging, but also migrant population is aging, and their parents are aging in countries of origin. And what we see definitely that there is a huge problem with the process of family reunification. Yeah, because kids, of course, they are young, perhaps healthy, whatever, but try to reunify someone who is suffering with Alzheimer's disease. So this is the case. What is kind of also not so seen in the migration studies. We don't see those old people. I think the concept of aging is also somehow neglected. Yeah, we don't see older migrants as well, because perhaps they are even not just not productive, but also not reproductive as well. So I think this is kind of interesting. I also really like you pointed out the intersectional perspective on how we look on the concept of transnational families, that we have to look also on the concept of class. Definitely you have the evidence that the class is a crucial category and became to be, especially as you mentioned the case of UK, more and more crucial category, which plays a huge role in the process of family reunification. And I'm still thinking when we conduct our research on migration, we always speak about geography, locality, but the time, the concept of time is so crucial, especially here for the transnational families. Time plays a huge role, and temporality is, of course, linked to the labor migration and how we use it in EU, so-called Kleenex style, use it and throw away. We don't think about their social life, but so perhaps the time could be interesting category for us, for all of us to look at how time is shifting, transnational configuration in gender families. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that when you mentioned the case of Filipino transnational families, that sometimes perhaps the empowerment of women or something like this is not definite. It's a temporal. It could be transformed, and we don't know so much about it. We don't see this time dynamics in our research because we have so much trouble to gather data, I think, and we don't look on the time as a concept. So perhaps I will ask them later on to perhaps think about temporality and social reproduction. And I read a nice article by Nicole Constable, and the title is Global Assemblages of Families. So her argument there is, and I have kind of trouble with it, she's arguing that those transnational families are not kind of pathological form of families, because what we do as researchers also, we try to apply our normative approach to let's so-called traditional families. They have to be in one place. And okay, I understand this point. Don't make them kind of deviant. But on the other hand, how we can fight for their justice if we do not perceive this as problematic? As she's arguing that we can't see them as such problematic in a way how we look on them, look at them. So I'm just wondering, do you have the same trouble with this concept of global assemblages of families like I have?
Well, I think it's also whether, to some extent, I think you need to respect what the family, what the individual, the family wants to do, because it may be that people want to be live separate lives. But what I'm arguing is that the legislation prevents them where they don't want to live separate lives. So I'm not pathologizing them, or I'm saying that people often do want to live together, and they're prevented from doing so. And there are others, exactly, who do not want to, for various reasons who do not want to live together. But I think you can respect, in a sense, what the wishes are of how a family wants to live together. And there are, I mean, I didn't go into it, but there is a lot of literature which is looking at precisely critiquing the notion that nuclear families are the norm by, again, looking at the variety of African families, particularly in Africa or the Caribbean, where there may be different norms. And this has an impact on the way that women are stigmatized for migrating, you know, in terms of who do they leave their children or parents behind with.
So you suggest to give an agency to migrants to decide whether they want or not, but still to be sensitive to reflect structural inequalities in migration policies. Yeah, it's hard to.
Of course it's hard.
To balance it.
But particularly because migration policies are becoming, in this field, increasingly restrictive.
Yeah, and really like the point you highlighted, the absence of men's role in migration studies generally, not just studies on transnational fatherhood, but also masculinity.
Yes,
there are just
exactly.
few studies on this particular topic because we see them in their productive roles. We really don't think that they're supposed to be in their reproductive roles, not just in the countries of origin, but also through the process of migration.
But again, if we go back to a more recent literature of the last few years, looking at if using the concept of reproduction rather than care, we bring in a much broader group of activities. So, for example, in the US, the work that Hodania Sotelo has been doing on gardeners. So that's house maintenance, right? And then there's all the handymen literature that's been done both in Germany and in the UK, and that's largely men. And they've framed that within an international division of reproductive labour, because they would consider that the maintenance of the house is part of social reproduction. So that's a broader idea of the material, you could say the manual work that goes into reproducing one's livelihood, one's existence.
And also the last point is so crucial, especially for us living in the Czech Republic, because we are sending and also receiving country of domestic workers. We are working as caregivers in senior facilities or private home arrangements in Germany or in Austria as well. So this critique towards how we are not caring about those who give a care, especially we keep them in this transnational mode. And also, I think it includes also the right, for example, for the healthcare, proper healthcare here in the Czech Republic. So we have the situation when a woman is working as a caregiver in private homes, in service, so-called, and she's not able to obtain a basic or kind of decent healthcare. So this is the clash of care for those who care.
Yes, exactly.
It became to be more evident, and we have to think a lot about it. And I know that we had a meeting with Helma was last week in Linz or 2 weeks ago, and we spoke a lot about it. How we are somehow our Western society is trying to keep the autonomy of our senior people in certain way, but the price are inequalities and injustice for the other women who have to leave their own children or grandparents back home. And definitely this is not what we would like to go for. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure I will have a chance to speak with Eleonore, but I would like to open floor for the discussions or for the discussion. So if you have some article, task, questions. Okay, sorry. I haven't seen you.
Don't worry. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk, Eleonore. And I very much liked also how you focused on, or you pointed out that the social reproduction focuses on women and especially on those left behind, and that we should pay more attention to who cares for the carers. I was wondering, and I don't know if it's really, it might be a question to all of us, but sometimes I'm wondering how can we counter these very restrictive restrictive discourses on migrant management and family reunification, because other than with economic arguments, because as you said, like you gave this example of Canada, where it is shown that extended families do better than nuclear families, which I think is very important to show. But again, it's this economic argument, and of course it's an argument that is probably more accepted than any other. But as Petra said before, how do we then argue, for example, to bring in a grandmother or grandfather who has Alzheimer's? We cannot argue it with any economic, probably, or not, at least short-sighted economic arguments. And yeah, that's something, I mean, I'm struggling with also in my own work, especially when we go out to the public concerning refugees and so on. It's always this, how to frame it other than economic, and how then, that it's still acceptable.
Yes, I mean, let's say a former colleague of mine. I've worked with a legal scholar, and of course, one is trying to work on human rights instruments, and in the courts that has to some extent been has been effective. We took the UK Immigration Authority to court. That was using this report, but also through the NGO, which and we partially won. On children on the minimum income, it was arguing that they did not respect the legislation. Now, we have a Rights of Children, of course, Act, which nearly all states have signed. States don't always respect it, but there are international human rights instruments that you can use. But as you say quite rightly, it's more effective with children, because they have actually more rights. It's much more difficult with older people. But these states, apart from being more restrictive, usually these days you have to give a guarantee anyhow that you will pay for all of the costs of bringing in a parent. So they usually don't have access to healthcare. That has to be a private healthcare. And the problem is that states are still unwilling, even with that guarantee, to allow people to bring in their parents. Although other states, you see very clearly it is a class matter, because if you come to the front of the queue if you've got a lot of money. But coming back to your question, yes, I think it's a really difficult issue, because on the human rights side, which has been used, it usually involves judicial developments, but to try to convince the public is much, much more difficult. And as you say, it might be easier to say, well, I bring in a grandparent to help with my childcare. People understand that. It's a kind of something that they're working with themselves. Yes, but as I say, with somebody who's completely incapacitated, it's much more difficult. On the other hand, in the UK, the more incapacitated you are, your parent is, the more likely you'll get them in. So, I don't have there isn't an answer. And I think also one needs to work with civil society and with NGOs. It's not just a matter of trying to convince the state to change its policies. I think what we've tried also to do is to work at a popular level through the media, for example, can be quite important in supporting migrant rights. I mean, that, as I say, I agree with you. I think it's a very difficult question.
Thank you very much. So, other
Thank
questions?
you very much for your talk, and a bit following up on your last point, as a political scientist, I'm not surprised I'm interested in what would be the policy recommendations or solutions. I mean, we're talking about civil society, public opinion.
Yes.
But what level to address it? On a state level, global standards? I mean, some people say ILO Convention 189, that does not cover fully what we're talking about here, would be the first step in this direction. Maybe related to this, since I mentioned the Global Compact, it is what it is, of course, but my impression, and it would be very interesting to hear from you, within the framework of the compact, I thought that family was not sufficiently, but it was covered in quite some regards. We have the right to family, we have family reunification to be facilitated, quite often no child detention. I mean, it is not binding, as we all know. But I mean, it's topics that were the reason why the Migrant Worker Convention was not ratified, was family reunification. Now states like Germany are saying we're doing everything in the compact already, which is not true, because family reunification is part of it again. I would be very interested in hearing your points on this.
Yes, I did certainly pick, what I would say is look at the word, the discourse is important. It's facilitate. UN Women, I led the chapter on families on the move, and one of the areas we really had a difference was on the status of rights. I'm very sceptical. I think we need rights, but we can't think that just because we've got rights on paper, those rights get but they're very into rights, as you could imagine. And I pointed out to them, because they wanted to put into the report that you have the right to family life reunion, and I said, no, you don't have the right to it in the compact. It says facilitate, right? It doesn't say you have a right. It says facilitate. There's a difference.
Family, it says.
But facilitate is the wording is important, because it doesn't use the it's the facilitate which is the key thing. It's I think, rather than that you have a right. And even then, everybody thinks that the Article 8 in the European Convention, they keep on saying, oh, you should go for that. But it's so difficult to get a case, to win a case under Article 8. It's almost impossible. Because the Convention gives so much right to the state. Its sovereignty is so important in the Convention that it usually wins out in any case that you're going to take. So I agree that there were references to family and family members. I'm not disputing, but I think it still focused more, the compacts on the migrant compact on labour than on family, and I think that it's facilitating. And as I say, children have a lot more rights than adults, effectively, because there is a convention which nearly all states have signed, and they've been taken to court using that convention to abide by it. So, and on 189, I think actually it's successful in some respects beyond the state having signed it, because often it can be used as a catalyst. I mean, in the Irish case, for example, it was first used as a catalyst, and then they signed it. So,
thank you, Carol. I think you tried to show that you would like to ask something.
Thank you very much for the stimulating lecture. Actually, coming somehow close to what I'm going to speak about. Also, what I am thinking about is that is this completely new or not? I mean, it's sort of becoming the common practice across the world. Some call it the globalization of the kafala system. Others talk about global apartheid. And what I'm thinking about, is it so new? Because this practice of, only paying part of the value of labor, and having labor, having the family, having actually labor being reproduced elsewhere, like in the colonial situation, in the rural hinterland, and the same thing, more or less in apartheid. So there might be something new in the situation, but I just wonder if you have reflected about that. The continuity between the colonial practice and what we are saying today.
I mean, I think I didn't go into the whole history of, let's say, the question of, migration into the colonizers' heartland, and put it that way. It's gone through ups and downs, and actually in the 60s, there was quite a lot of discussion about family family members, but also what I'm arguing here is that what you do see in recent years is a tightening of the regulations in terms of both family reunification, but also use of welfare has become a very important attack, and restrictions on use of welfare. So I'm not trying to say it's new, I'm trying to say that we do have fluctuations, and what we're seeing is a period where, in that sense, that if you look at restricting access to welfare for family members is also shifting the burden of social reproduction onto the migrant family. That's what I'm actually arguing. I'm not saying it's completely new, but I'm saying we're in a period where it's shifting more onto the migrant family and the migrant themselves, even as individuals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Rosanna, perhaps she's looking to ask something.
yes, just
The last
well,
question.
thanks a lot for the presentation, and my question is actually a bit follow-up. You talked about forced transnationalism, and you just briefly mentioned that there are different forms. So one is definitely this restriction on family reunification, but then forced transnationalism is also connected to forced migration.
Yes.
And then, to prevent it is to talk also about the right not to migrate.
Yes.
So, connected to, eliminating global inequalities, development policies at the policy levels, etc. And I was just wondering, as you actually mentioned that the migrants' contribution to social reproduction is often put aside, and at the same time, I think in thinking and also theorizing of development, it is also put aside, even though it is sort of obvious. And those development policies connected with the migration discourses would look very much different if they are formulated with regard to the issues of social reproduction. So I was thinking, I would like to ask you, do you see this line of thought also brought by feminist, recent feminist research on social reproduction, or is this, I don't know, still...
Oh, that's a huge topic. No, because, the discussion amongst feminists, I think, is still focused on the global north. There's another discussion which Shirin Rai has been doing very interesting work on depletion, which links up, and that's largely, and I don't know that I don't like the term global north and global south either, because I think that's awfully binary, so I'm not quite sure. It's a difficulty, what do we use, in terms of classifications, because whatever we use kind of gives us these either simplistic divisions or binaries. But let's say she's not looking at societies like the UK, so she's looking at depletion of resources, and to what extent are the depletion of resources made up in terms of social reproduction. But I would also argue that if you look at the literature in relation to development on remittances, there's a tendency to focus originally on remittances and so-called productive activities. And I would argue that when you look at a lot of the remittances that are sent, and again, we don't know if it's by the men and women, but certainly the remittances sent by women are going back to other women. There's a lot of evidence of that. And they are being used for social reproduction because they're being used for education for their children. Food is social reproduction after all. Buying commodity, objects in consumer goods is social reproduction. But so we've got this whole array of things that they're sending money back, and often health is another area where they're sending money back so that you can buy better. You have to go private quite often, but actually if you look at what those remittances are being used for, it's social reproduction. It's not necessary. Some women will put the money into, for example, a business, but as Gioconda Herrera said it's to make up the skinny nature of the state. Basically, the state has withdrawn from providing welfare, i.e. social reproduction, and this is what remittances are being used for. We need to be quite clear about it.
I'm writing about it in this particular issue. It's called Sentimental Money.
Oh, you're all right. Well, I wouldn't have...
So just to advertise my work.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
By listening Professor Kofman.
No. So I'm saying that's how I would use it, connect up with the development